Hello, everyone. If other speakers have said, it is good to get out of the bedroom, but it's also a wee bit out of the comfort zone, I have to say, and particularly the comfort of my slippers. There are advantages to working from home, it has to be said. So I'm delighted to be here to speak as the head of Renewable NI. And indeed, I'm delighted so many of our members are speaking with you today, because they can probably tell you the story better than I can. But I want to thank Invest NI for the invite and for putting on today's event. Renewable NI is the trade association for the renewable electricity industry in Northern Ireland. We were co-founded by Renewable UK and Wind Energy Ireland, a kind of collaboration coming together to create the trade association in Northern Ireland. But I think as our next slide will show, we're increasingly becoming an independent association in the sense of developing our membership locally and indeed developing our team. Our members are engaged in wind, solar and battery storage, and as well as onshore and offshore and small scale and large scale. I think it's important to point that out, because you often get a debate: is it onshore, is it offshore, is it wind, is it solar, is it small scale, is it large scale? It's all of those things if we're going to meet our decarbonisation ambitions. And as I've said, you'll see in the slide that the list of our members, and a number of them are speaking today. If you don't see your own company here, but you do see yourself engaging within the renewable electricity industry, speak to me about Renewable NI membership. And this is just some of the forums that our members get access to, and you'll see there our offshore working group, which we set up about a year ago. And I'm going to say prescience on my part, so much has changed in the past year in terms of offshore, so much has developed, that I think it was definitely the right time to set up that group. It was to inform our response to the energy strategy, because I felt we were light in terms of what we were asking for on offshore, but we're really seeing the offshore industry grow in Northern Ireland, albeit we don't yet have projects in or on the water. But I think as a trade association, sometimes we lead our members. When it comes to offshore, we're really being led by our members who are really driving things forward. So from 40 by 20 to 0 by 50, and I've deliberately mixed metrics here, because if we sort of looking at the policy context, and Richard will be more than familiar with this journey, we started off with a 40% renewable electricity target by 2020. But even as the head of the Association for Renewable Electricity, renewable generation, we recognise, is a means to an end. It's a means to decarbonisation. Where we need to get to is to zero carbon, to net zero greenhouse gases, and we've really seen the policy environment change in that regard. And some of these reports in between have been reports we've commissioned. I suppose looking backwards, the wind dividend report by Baringa showed that our investments in renewable electricity have not just helped decarbonise, but have also put a downward pressure on the wholesale price of electricity, resisting some of the increases in consumer bills. More recently, our Achieving Zero report maps out to a fully zero carbon power system in Northern Ireland, and that ultimately, and I'll talk a wee bit about the 80 by 30 target, the 80% renewables target by 2030. But really, it's that full decarbonisation that is the prize, is the aim. So we worked very hard to get an 80% target. We've just achieved it, but we're already thinking ahead to where we're going next. And our Power and a Green Economy report looked at onshore wind and the potential it has in terms of the Northern Ireland economy, potential to increase GVA by over 3 billion. That was authored by KPMG, and you've heard from Russell today. Most of my figures tend to come from Russell, or indeed from colleagues in Baringa. So RNI's key objectives, as you can see there, as I say, ultimately we want to get to zero carbon electricity by 2035. 80 by 30 is an incredibly important target, but it is a staging post. And I think what we need to do is learn the lessons of the Strategic Energy Framework, which was incredibly successful in getting to over 40% renewables by 2020, but there was almost a cliff edge. You know, and I remember in my former role as an MLA asking somebody in the department, DETI as it was then, you know, what do we do after 2020? And it was as if there is no after 2020. We need to get away from that type of thinking. We need to look at the end goal and work our way back rather than just the staging posts along the way, as important as they are to measure our projects. There's going to be a number of enablers. I've picked out a few key ones. It's already been referenced by Richard, extension of the CFD scheme to Northern Ireland. That's going to be vital. We're the only part of these islands without a support scheme for renewable electricity. And we had a 3-year hiatus, is probably a kind word, where we developed no new large-scale renewables in Northern Ireland because we had that kind of cliff edge of support of the narrow and then nothing to replace it. And we're starting to catch up on ourselves now with the first 2 new wind farms connected at the beginning of this year. But, you know, when we look at where we are now and where we need to get to in terms of decarbonisation, we couldn't afford those 3 years, and we really need, and I'll use the term that's been repeated, we really need to accelerate things now if we're going to achieve our 80 by 30 target, or indeed our zero carbon power by 2035 that we'd like to see. And that, I suppose, to put that target in context, that's a GB target currently. It doesn't extend to Northern Ireland, but already Boris Johnson's talking about bringing that target date forward. We'll see if that comes to pass, but it just shows the speed at which we need to be moving. A facilitative planning regime, and you know, most of the frustrations we have as an industry are from our onshore members who are seeking planning permission now. But I have to say, we have DFE here today. I'm not sure if we have DERA, but when our members in the offshore sector speak to us, they say, we're engaging with DFE, we're engaging with DERA, things are moving in the right direction. You know, we don't quite have everything we want yet, but we feel like we're getting there. When I ask about, well, what about DFI? Because at the end of the day, you have to bring the electricity onshore. They've told us we're not ready to engage yet. That's not good enough, because it is the single biggest frustration of our members, whether it be offshore or onshore, is the planning system. If we do not meet our 2030 target, it will not be for the lack of will of the renewable electricity industry. It'll be the lack of planning consent that'll beat us. And it's the one thing that members tell me over and again. And if I sound frustrated because I suppose I'm getting members saying to me, Stephen, it's not good enough, it's my job to try to improve that. I'm passing that frustration on, because ultimately DFI, and I don't believe they're in the room today, and I think that speaks volumes. They need to be in the room. They need to engage early. Will made the point that the Crown Estate are engaging with National Grid early and about learning the lessons of how we do things with greater pace. Engaging early from all stakeholders needs to happen, and that includes DFI. Enabled by delivery of offshore, and the reason why that's such a general comment is I'm going to kind of go in to the various aspects of enabling offshore. So we need Northern Ireland Offshore Action Plan, and as Richard has alluded to, that's already underway. I know there's a working group being established, and Renewable NI is delighted that we'll play our part in that. So that's something we need. It's happening. We need inclusion in the Crown Estate leasing. Again, we've heard from Will. When I spoke to Will, I think it was probably about 6 months ago, it was probably, you know, there were a number of things needed to be in place before Crown Estate would even look at Northern Ireland. But if we look at those things, those challenges that Will put to me, thanks to the work of DFE, thanks to the work of DERA, thanks to the work of Sony, and others, those things are starting to get put in place. And whilst we don't yet have a Northern Ireland leasing round secured, again, at least we've got Crown Estate here today, and they are engaging with us. And again, it feels like that's coming. We'll always want it quicker. That's the nature of a trade association, but it's in process. A strategic environmental assessment, again, speaking to DFE, they're in the process of commissioning that, so it's coming. An offshore connections process, we've started engaging with Sony on this. They'll be part of the offshore working group, and again, we're not there yet. We don't know quite yet what that process will look like, but it's coming. And a decommissioner of last resort, and again, that's something that DFE is looking at. So there's a number of number of boxes we need to tick before we get what ultimately will be a new industry for Northern Ireland. It's kind of, in a way, feels like what's coming, but is never quite come yet, is the offshore industry. But it really feels, and we've seen the SBM project launch 2 weeks ago. We'll see further announcements in terms of offshore projects for NI. So this really is an industry that's ready to kick off. And the benefits, I'm delighted Russell was here to present some figures, because I suppose we haven't quite gathered the figures yet. We're working with BVGA Associates to do a supply chain study to show what the potential is for Northern Ireland. But there will be jobs in offshore, as was pointed out. The turbines are 1/3 of the investment made in offshore. We will really see local benefits for supply chain companies here in Northern Ireland, both from our domestic market as well as the wider markets of these islands. Energy security has never been higher up the agenda. And again, I suppose back to my point on planning consents. In England, there's effectively been a moratorium in onshore development. The Prime Minister has come out and said basically that has to go. There's recognition. Boris Johnson's now talking about renewable development as being part of our national security, and the need to accelerate the rollout of new renewables. We need that type of energy. We need that type of direction from government here in Northern Ireland if we're developing our local energy security. We've so much potential. We are at over 40% renewables, but again, we need to get ourselves weaned off imported fossil fuels. Consumer savings, there's come to some figures later on this, but what renewables does is keep the pressure down and wholesale price. And while maybe consumers aren't seeing that at the minute because gas is still the price setter, as we move to more and more greater levels of renewable penetration, we'll see a greater impact of that price. And I'll get into the detail on that in a wee minute. But one thing I will say, we've talked about the extension of the CFD to Northern Ireland. Right now, those who've been successful in CFD contracts in Great Britain are paying huge sums back to the consumer, because that's how the CFD work. It's a price, it's a risk sharing, it's a price guarantee, and when the market price goes up, as it has now, renewable generators pay back to the consumer, and that's what we need to see, that type of risk sharing for Northern Ireland, so that we give confidence for renewable energy investors, but also we give security to consumers that the market price won't rocket up, and what that brings is, and it comes to my next point, is price stability. The fuel price of renewables is zero. It doesn't go up, it doesn't go down. So once you've made the initial investment, you've got predictability of price. And again, that's something that consumers could really do with presently. And obviously carbon reductions. As I say, renewables are a means to an end. This is about the decarbonisation journey, and again, I'll come to some figures on that. So we commissioned Baringa to produce our Achieving Zero report, which had two phases. It looked at getting to 80% renewables and then ultimately to a fully zero carbon electricity system. And they benchmarked, because at that time we sort of anticipated that there would be a 70% target. We were still at that point campaigning for an 80% by 2030 target. So Baringa benchmarked a lot of their work against the 70% target, looking at what the additional value 80% would bring. And in terms of carbon emissions, it would reduce CO2 emissions in the power sector, going from 70 to 80% by 600,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. And I suppose to put the 80% target in context, in total, it would reduce carbon emissions from the power sector by 75% from where we are today. So we're currently at around about 2.8 megatons of carbon from our power system. We can reduce that down, as I say, by around 75% by getting to 80% renewables by 2030. And Bringa also estimated then what would the additional savings be for consumers, and this is net savings. This is after all the investments we need to make in grid infrastructure and through the renewable support scheme, however it looks like. NIE did a piece of work called Network for Net Zero that said going to 70% would actually result in a net 1% saving on consumer bills. Sort of building on that, then Bringa looked at going to 80%, and they said there'd be an additional £50 million saving in 2030 for consumers. So report after report after report after report shows that the more renewables we get in the system, the more we depress the wholesale price, and the better it is for consumers. So I suppose just to finish off, Renewable NI is running a number of webinars on various renewable topics, and the reason why I've kept our past webinars on is not just because I'm lazy and didn't want to update the slide, but it's because the webinars are available on our website. It's a free series sponsored by Ed Goodbody, so we're able to provide them free and provide the videos on our website for those who can't attend at the time. So as you see, we're going offshore on the 6th of September, so you know we'll hopefully by that stage have our BVGA work completed and have a lot more figures for you about the local market. So that's everything from me. Listen, thank you very much for your time. I look forward to chatting during the break.